Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie in Bavaria, better known as Sisi, was born on December 24, 1837 as the fourth child and second daughter of Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria and Princess Ludovica of Bavaria. Elisabeth spent a happy childhood with her sisters and brothers in Possenhofen. Their parents had no obligations to the Bavarian court, and so the children were able to have the freedom they needed. From her father, Sisi inherited an aversion to ceremony, a love of nature and horses, and a passion for traveling. Princess Sophie of Bavaria, the mother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, arranged, together with her sister Ludovica, that the emperor should marry Ludovica's daughter Helene. So in 1853, the then 15-year-old Elisabeth accompanied her mother and elder sister Helene on a trip to the Austrian Bad Ischl, where Helene was introduced to the 23-year-old emperor. However, Franz Joseph only had eyes for Sisi and decided to marry her instead of Nene. The emperor got his way, and on August 19, 1853, the betrothal of Franz Joseph and Sisi was officially announced. For Sisi, being betrothed to the emperor meant that she had to give up her personal freedom. As she was not raised to be an empress, Sisi received a rigorous education prior to the wedding. The pressure put on the young woman caused her to become increasingly quiet in the days before the wedding. On April 22, 1854, Elisabeth arrived in Vienna, where she married Franz Joseph on April 24, 1854, at the Augustinerkirche. After the ceremony, the pressure had become too much for Sisi, and she burst into tears and fled from the festivities. During the first months after the wedding, Sisi attempted to follow the court's protocol, but she quickly began to suffer the loss from her personal freedom, causing her to suffer from insomnia and a lack of appetite. As she had grown up free and outside of the city, she had immense issues adjusting to her new life. In order to feel more comfortable, Sisi had a gymnasium installed at the Hofburg. She also wanted to have a bathtub and toilet installed in her apartments. These excessive riches for the time caused Sisi to be heavily criticized. But Franz Joseph granted Elisabeth these facilities as she was the first member of the imperial family. Quite swiftly after their marriage, Elisabeth gave birth to 3 children in a short amount of time: Sophie, Gisela, and an heir to the Austrian throne, Rudolf. Although Sisi wanted her children close to her, court protocol dictated that her place was aside her husband, the emperor, instead of in the nursery. She was only allowed to see her children at set times. As this made Sisi extremely unhappy, eventually it was allowed for the children to stay in a room closer to Sisi's apartments. During a visit to Hungary with her daughters Sophie and Gisela, both children became ill. Gisela recovered, but unfortunately, Sophie died in the early hours of May 29, 1857, from the effects of an intestinal infection. After the death of her eldest daughter, Empress Elisabeth plunged into a severe depression from which she would suffer for a long time. Blaming herself for her daughter's death, Sisi locked herself away and refused to eat. Eventually, her lack of eating led her to suffer from anorexia, and her behavior became increasingly strange as a result. After she gave birth to Rudolf, Sisi's health weakened, and to prevent lung disease, Elisabeth left for Madeira in 1860 on doctor's advice. She further visited Corfu and Venice, causing her to be absent from the Viennese court for 2 years. Upon her return, her children Gisela and Rudolf were completely estranged from her. Although Sisi felt no connection to her children, she did intervene when she noticed her son's increasing unhappiness after being entrusted to a tutor, the General Count of Lorraine origin, Charles Léopold de Gondrecourt, who was known for his strictness. He traumatized the child with very harsh, counterproductive and unsuitable teaching methods. After the intervention of the Empress, Gondrecourt was replaced by Colonel Count Joseph Latour from Tourenbourg, who was able to win the love of his pupil. The change provided Rudolf with a much more pleasant childhood, and he remained grateful to his mother for it. Nevertheless, the Empress generally seemed to care little for her son, although of all her children, he was the most like her. Due to her depression, Elisabeth was always traveling and thus neglecting her duties and her family. Despite Sisi's dislike for state affairs, she was a noted supporter of the Hungarian independence efforts and influenced the emperor towards signing the 1867 Austro-Hungarian Compromise, which saw the Habsburg Empire officially morph into Austria-Hungary, also known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On June 8, 1867, Elisabeth and Franz Joseph were crowned King and Queen of Hungary. 10 months later, Elisabeth gave birth to their fourth child, a daughter who they named Marie-Valérie. Unlike her other children, Sissi was allowed to raise Marie-Valérie herself, resulting in a strong bond between mother and daughter. As Sissi grew older, she became more image conscious and she started to follow increasingly extreme diets, resulting in the extreme low weight of 47 kilos for a woman who was 172 centimeters or 5'8" tall. At the age of 31, she no longer allowed herself to be photographed as she feared getting older. The Empress would often use her fan to shield herself from photographers. Around 1882, Elisabeth developed rheumatism and sciatica. Due to these illnesses, she could no longer go horseback riding, so in order to stay slim, she would henceforth go on hours of forced marches. In 1889, Sissi's 30-year-old son Rudolf shot his 17-year-old mistress, the Baroness Marie von Vetzera, in Mayerling and then committed suicide. Elisabeth did not overcome this blow and sank into depression as she felt guilty about her son's death. Her grief did not allow her to attend her son's burial in the Kaisergruft, but a few days later she visited his grave. For Elisabeth, a time of even more restless traveling began. She was hardly ever in Vienna again. On September 10, 1898, during a trip to Switzerland, the Empress left the Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva at around 1:30 p.m. to arrive at the mountain resort of Caux after a trip on the paddle steamer Genève. As she walked along the Quai Mont Blanc lakeside promenade, accompanied by her lady-in-waiting Irma Starai, the Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini lunged at her in front of the boat landing and plunged a sharpened file into her heart. The wound made by the stiletto-shaped file was so small that the Empress did not notice it and thought the attacker had failed to strike her. She stood up, thanked the passengers-by who had rushed to help, and chatted with her lady-in-waiting about the incident. The Empress continued and boarded the steamer, but shortly after the steamer departed, she finally collapsed and lost consciousness. The ship returned to the dock and the Empress was taken to her hotel on a makeshift stretcher. All attempts at resuscitation were in vain. Elisabeth in Bavaria, Empress of Austria, died on September 10, 1898 at 2:40 p.m. She was 60 years old. An autopsy was performed on Sissi's body to determine the exact cause of her death. It was discovered that she had died of a heart attack as a result of the injuries she sustained in the Lucchini attack. Elisabeth's funeral was a solemn event with full military honors. Her body was transported throughout the empire and thousands of people gathered to watch the funeral procession. The bell of Geneva's La Clémence Cathedral rang as the Empress' funeral train passed by. Her funeral was one of the biggest in Austrian history. Although Sisi had expressed wishes to be buried on Corfu, she was interned at the Kapuziner Gruft in Vienna. Luigi Lucchini, Sissi's killer, was apprehended by civilians on the streets of Geneva and handed over to judicial authorities. Lucchini had reportedly been following the Empress for several days, waiting for the right moment for his attack. Lucchini was put on trial in Geneva in October 1898. He was sentenced to life imprisonment as the death penalty had already been abolished in Geneva at that time. After a first failed attempt in 1900, Eugenie took his own life in prison on October 19, 1910. Although Sisi has an almost mythical status today, her role in history should not be overestimated. In Austrian historiography, she is only mentioned indirectly. In the 20th century, she became an icon comparable to Princess Diana, a freedom-loving spirit amidst the rigid court ceremonial, a tragic figure, and her life has inspired many writers and film and theater makers. Thank you for watching.